The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the small downtown streets. It was that golden hour when the world feels both alive and vulnerable. People bustled around, laughter floated through the air, and shops displayed their colorful wares, but that evening something sinister was brewing just out of sight. Jake Collins was a 32-year-old man with a heart that raced with ambition. He had a steady job, a faithful dog named Max, and just enough savings to dream of a brighter future. But that particular afternoon, as he walked to his car, the sense of safety that typically hugged this neighborhood started to fade. Little did he know that his day was about to take a dangerous turn. He approached a nondescript gray sedan, casually scrolling through his messages. Suddenly, as he reached for his door handle, he heard the growl of an engine rev and two shadowy figures emerged from the darkness. They were fast, too fast. Dressed in hoodies and with faces partially obscured, they stormed toward Jake, their intentions clear. One shouted, brandishing a knife that glinted menacingly in the dying light. Instinct kicked in. Jake's heart thumped violently in his chest. In that split second, fear clawed at his insides, but underneath the fear, another feeling began to ignite, a burning rage. Jake shouted, taking a step forward, defying their expectations. That was the first mistake they made. They had assumed that a man alone in a parking lot was nothing but an easy target. But Jake was more than just a man. He was a fighter, a protector. Something deep within him surged, a primal instinct that had lain dormant. Instead of retreating, he advanced. The thugs exchanged a glance, a flicker of confusion crossing their faces. They weren't prepared for resistance. In fact, they were expecting submission. The neighborhood around buzzed, a world oblivious to the storm brewing just a few feet away. With all the bravado he could muster, Jake unleashed his rage, channeling everything he had into one swift motion. He lunged at the knife-wielding assailant, using their momentum against them. Time slowed. Jake could see the surprise in their eyes as they recoiled in disbelief. Each footfall echoed in the fading light as he tackled one of them hard against the concrete. They hit the ground with a thud that reverberated through the air, disrupting the casual chaos of the late afternoon. Jake felt a hard rush, focusing every ounce of adrenaline into holding the assailant down. He shouted, the words bursting forth like flames igniting in a dark room. The second thug, initially hesitant, lunged at Jake with a fury fueled by panic. As adrenaline coursed through Jake's veins, he pivoted just in time, delivering a swift kick that sent the attacker sprawling backward. It all happened in a flurry, an explosion of chaotic energy that left them both breathless. Jake felt a rush of power surging through him, a sensation so different from the feeling of helplessness he had initially faced. But even as the tide turned, it wasn't just physical strength that tipped the scale. It was the profound realization that in moments of peril, one can either surrender or rise from the ashes. And Jake had chosen to rise. As he wrestled with the assailant pinned beneath him, Jake's confident voice cut through the tension. You think this is a game? He felt the balance shift from vulnerability to dominance, but he didn't just want to win, he wanted to make them understand the weight of their choices. The two thugs, caught off guard by Jake's resolve, scrambled for control, but their efforts faltered against Jake's unwavering strength. One of them gasped, "We didn't mean to hurt anyone." It was a cry born from desperation, but it only stoked the fire within Jake. Who were they to claim innocence now? The echoes of their threats rang in his ears, drumming up a fury that demanded justice. He roared, the single word slicing through the air. You don't get to backtrack now. There was no mistaking the horror etched across their faces. They were just two frightened boys, but they had crossed a line. With each shuddering breath and racing pulse, Jake felt the weight of their choices settle onto his shoulders. They had disrespected the sanctity of his world, challenged his freedom. The assailant beneath him squirmed, his eyes darting around for help, for escape, but there was none. On the fringes, a few passersby had noticed the commotion and were staring, their shock mingling with curiosity, a mixture of fear and adrenaline in the air. Jake shouted toward the gathering crowd, asserting his control of the situation, demanding action, awakening the timid witnesses from their daze. And just like that, the air transformed. Jake could feel the tension shift, the sense that help was on the way, the cavalry, as they say, was coming. For once, the world around him felt like it had his back. The pinned thug began to whimper, the bravado of the streets crumbling in the face of reality. Please. But Jake had heard enough of empty apologies. The time for whimpering was over. These were not young children slipping into mischief. They had made a conscious choice to threaten someone's life, to disrupt the peace of an entire community. His mind raced, sorting through a million thoughts in seconds as he kept his weight firmly on the thug beneath him. Memories flooded back, the people he loved, the life he had built. They were worth fighting for, worth defending against the recklessness of others. Seconds ticked away like minutes, each heartbeat a reminder of the urgency at hand. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, a promise of resolution drawing nearer. It was a stark realization their recklessness could have cost him everything. He was surrounded by family, friends, home, a tapestry of life that these two boys threatened to rip apart in a single moment. Their need for quick cash disguised as bravery had unleashed a force they weren't ready to contend with. When the police finally arrived, their brilliant lights swept over the scene, illuminating the tableau of chaos. Officers rushed toward Jake and the assailant pinned beneath him, ready for intervention, ready to handle a situation they'd seen unfold 1,000 times. For one brief moment, Jake locked eyes with the boy he had pinned. In that instant, an unspoken understanding passed between them, something deeper than mere words. There was fear, there was anger, but beneath it lay a haunting awareness of consequence. He saw the flicker of regret ignite in the thug's eyes, a realization that their choices had led to this destructive confrontation. As officers pulled Jake to his feet, they formed a wall between him and the offenders who were now being handcuffed. The adrenaline still coursed through his body, surging with every heartbeat as he replayed the moment over and over in his mind. One officer asked, glancing between Jake and the struggling assailants. And just like that, Jake transformed from a victim to a reluctant hero, relaying the story of the attempted robbery. His voice steadied as he spoke, conviction cutting through the chaos. "They thought they could take from me," he declared with a resolute strength. The tension in the air dissipated as the police processed the scene. A crowd formed, whispers ricocheting around, each person caught in the aftermath of this encounter. For many, it was an eye-opening reality, a close brush with the darkness that strayed too close to their lives. Jake took a deep, cleansing breath as he walked away from the scene, Max wagging his tail expectantly by his side. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to bask in the triumph of standing his ground, but he also knew that victory isn't just about physical confrontation. Sometimes it's about facing the fear head-on and overcoming it with strength and conviction. That evening, as Jake sat in his living room with Max curled at his feet, he reflected on what had happened. It wasn't about being a superhero or a fighter. It was about reclaiming his sense of self, his space in the world. He felt a wave of gratitude wash over him for the community that had stood by, for the police who had arrived in time, and for the simple moments of normalcy that had been scattered like confetti to the wind yet again. Not every confrontation ends in triumph. He knew that well, but this one reaffirmed a truth that had once felt buried beneath layers of doubt. That courage is often born not from the absence of fear, but from making a choice when it dances at the edge of reason. With a renewed sense of purpose, Jake rose from his seat, moving toward the window. The stars twinkled like scattered dreams above, and in the heart of that serene scene, he found a sense of peace that no thief could ever take from him again. Jake never expected his uneventful Tuesday afternoon would turn into a decisive moment that would change the course of his life. He stepped out of his office building at exactly 5:30 p.m., the sunlight radiating off the glass windows, casting a warm glow on the bustling street. People laughed and chatted, the melodic sounds of a nearby street musician drifting through the air. Jake smiled to himself, grateful for the small comforts of life, a good job, a loyal dog waiting at home, and the promise of a cozy evening. But as he reached his car, a nondescript gray sedan ominously parked a few feet away caught his eye. He shrugged off the feeling, attributing it to the remnants of the morning's caffeine buzz. His mind was elsewhere, planning what he would do with his free evening. Little did he know, shadows were lurking in the corners of that vibrant day, ready to strike. In a heartbeat, the mood shifted. Two figures exploded from the car, both wearing hoodies that obscured most of their faces. Jake barely had time to react as they charged at him. Panic seized his chest like a vice. The taller one swung a knife, the blade glinting cruelly in the last rays of sunlight. He yelled, his voice dripping with aggression. Fear shot through Jake, paralyzing him momentarily. His mind raced, bombarded by thoughts of self-preservation, but deep down, beneath the adrenaline and terror, something else lurked. An ember of defiance began to spark within him. In that moment, he had a choice. He could stay frozen in fear or fight back. Drawing on some primal instinct, Jake shifted his weight forward, feeling the adrenaline surging through his veins. He roared, surprising even himself with the strength of his voice. The assailants paused, caught off guard by this unexpected resistance. They had anticipated compliance, not defiance. It was a rookie mistake, and they were about to pay for it. Fueled by a newfound determination, Jake sprang into action, closing the distance between them. His movements felt almost choreographed, each punch and kick driven by instinct. He targeted the man with the knife, aiming to disarm him. Time seemed to slow as he dove forward, grappling with the would-be attacker. Jake could feel the man's panic ripple through him, but Jake wasn't afraid. He yelled, wrestling for control. Around them, the noise of the street faded away as all Jake could hear was the pounding of his heart and the rise and fall of his own voice. He pushed the thug back hard, sending him stumbling into a wall. But the other assailant, recovering from the shock, lunged at Jake. Desperation gripped him and he kicked out, connecting solidly with the second thug's stomach. A gasp escaped the man's lips, and in that split second of confusion, the man dropped his knife. Jake seized the moment, grabbing it and pointing it at the would-be robbers. He commanded, panting but resolute. Fear flickered across their faces. They hadn't expected this fierceness. They had thought him weak, unprepared, but in that entire tussle, Jake had awakened something deep inside him. He had tasted the thrill of standing his ground. The taller thief gasped, his bravado fading. A little part of Jake felt a rush of satisfaction knowing that he had turned the tides, but he didn't let it consume him. "You think this is a joke? You have no idea what you're doing," he growled, every word laced with anger and defiance. At that moment, the reality of their choices hung thick in the air. They wanted what was not theirs, and they were met not with submission but with resistance. It was a lesson learning itself through the chaos. Jake felt empowered, knowing he was protecting not just himself, but also the community he cherished. He kept the knife steady as he observed their shifts and glances, knowing they were looking for an escape. They were just a pair of scared boys, but they had gone too far. You need to understand the weight of your actions. Their fear became palpable, transforming them from aggressors to simply scared kids caught in a bad situation. Jake's heart raced not just with adrenaline, but with something deeper. He realized it wasn't just about fighting back. It was about reclaiming his space in the world, about standing tall against forces that threatened it. More onlookers gathered, hesitant but intrigued, their eyes wide with disbelief at the scene unfolding. Jake shouted toward the crowd, urging them to act, to break the tension that seemed to thicken with every moment that passed. "Please, man," the shorter one stammered, desperation etched into his features. Jake barked, cutting him off. As the sirens wailed in the distance, approaching quickly, the reality began to set in for the attackers. Their chances were dwindling, and with it, their posturing began to crumble. Just then, a thought struck Jake. I could just hand you over to the police right now. You could face real consequences for what you've done." The knife in his hand felt heavy, but it wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of his defiance. Suddenly, as the blue and red lights began to illuminate the darkness around them, he felt a powerful wave washing over him, a mix of fear, anger, and a surge of courage. He wasn't just fighting for his wallet, he was fighting for respect, for dignity, for every person who has ever felt trapped by fear. When the police arrived, their authoritative presence broke the standoff. Officers quickly assessed the scene, tackling the assailants and securing them in handcuffs. Jake stepped back, adrenaline still buzzing through him, excitement and relief washing over him like a wave. An officer asked as others began to detain the two thugs. Jake let out a shaky breath, finding his voice again. "They tried to rob me. I refused to let them take anything," he responded, solidifying his place in this moment of chaos. Surrounded by police and witnesses, Jake felt an unexpected sense of clarity. No longer just a victim, he had fought back, reclaiming his space, the entire narrative of that encounter shifting in the blink of an eye. He stood tall, chest heaving, but his spirit unwavering. As the officers led the attackers away, Jake locked eyes with the shorter one once more. Beneath the fear and desperation, he could see a flicker of understanding. Whether it was guilt or regret, Jake didn't know. He had seen more than just two would-be robbers. He had seen a moment of reckoning. That night, Jake lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, reflecting on all that had happened. The events of the day replayed like a film in his mind. He had found strength he didn't know he possessed, overcome fear he thought would paralyze him, and stood firmly in the face of those who sought to undermine him. He knew he had encountered a deep lesson about boundaries and the human spirit. Those thugs had taught him more than they could know. It was not just about what they tried to take from him, it was about what he had learned to protect. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through his window, Jake woke with a renewed sense of purpose. It was no longer just about being an everyday guy. It was about becoming an active participant in his life, shaping his reality. He was never going to be a victim. He was going to be a defender of his home, his loved ones, and himself. The events would eventually fade into a memory, but the strength it had ignited would forge a new path ahead. Jake stepped out into the light of the day, a smile breaking across his face. He was alive and he was free, and he had found his voice in the most unexpected moment, a reminder that sometimes our greatest battles lead us to our most profound victories. And so, as he walked down the street, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope blooming within him. He had faced fear and defiance head-on, only to emerge braver than ever. Jake knew that no matter what happened next, he would always face the challenges life threw at him with resilience and courage. His world was brighter, and in that moment, he whispered a promise to himself. Never again would he be caught unprepared. Life was unpredictable, undoubtedly, but so was he. The bustling street was alive with laughter and chatter as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Jake Collins felt good about life. He had just received a promotion at work, and after a long week, he was headed home to celebrate with his friends. His mind buzzed with thoughts of the evening ahead, a steak dinner, maybe a drink or two. He walked with a spring in his step, the warmth of the day wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. But as he neared his car, parked in the dimly lit corner of the lot, he suddenly felt a shift in the atmosphere. The laughter faded into the background, replaced by a sharp edge of awareness. A gray sedan sat suspiciously close, and two figures lingered just a couple of cars away, their hoodie-clad bodies slumped against the side. A chill danced along Jake's spine, warning him that something wasn't right. He brushed off the feeling, telling himself he was overreacting. The sound of his keys jingled in his pocket as he fumbled to unlock the car, but before he could even open the door, those figures came to life. One of them shouted, a young man with wild eyes that sparkled with desperation. The command sliced through the air, and Jake's heart raced into overdrive. The second figure lunged forward, brandishing a knife that gleamed menacingly in the fading light. For a split second, time stood still. Jake's mind flooded with a million thoughts: fear, anger, disbelief. What were they thinking? Did they believe he would just hand over everything without a fight? Instinct kicked in as adrenaline coursed through his veins, pushing aside the panic. Jake yelled, feeling the fire of defiance surge through him. The assailants hesitated, not expecting resistance. In their world, people didn't fight back, they bowed down, submitting to fear. But Jake refused to conform to their expectations. With an unexpected burst of courage, he took a step forward, shifting from a potential victim to a man unwilling to be robbed of his dignity. The taller one stammered. His bravado cracked slightly. Jake took a deep breath, grounding himself in the reality of the moment. "You think I'm going to let you take what's mine?" Before they could react, Jake darted forward. The world around him blurred, his focus narrowing in on the knife-wielding attacker. A primal instinct overtook him. In that brief moment, fear transformed into determination. He lunged, grappling the man's arm with a fierce grip, twisting it as he fought for control of the blade. Jake's heart raced, and the weight of adrenaline sent a new wave of energy surging through his body. He had never been in any serious fight before, but in this moment he felt alive. He pushed forward, channeling every ounce of rage and resistance into that struggle. The knife slipped from the attacker's grasp, clattering to the ground as Jake crashed into him, sending both of them tumbling to the pavement. "Stop!" the second thug yelled, scrambling back, panic finally creeping onto his face. The tables had turned, but even with the advantage at hand, Jake's instincts screamed at him to remain vigilant. Instead of feeling like the victor, doubts and questions lingered. He was no fighter, just a regular guy pushed to the brink. But that regular guy was no longer willing to back down. Jake growled, clenching the fallen knife and pointing it toward them. "You think you can come at me like this?" His voice rang out loud and clear, a mixture of bravado and raw emotion. In that instant, he refused to be a mere statistic, an easy target for desperate men. The fear in their eyes was palpable, and for the first time, Jake felt a rush of power. The tall one pleaded, desperation spilling from his lips. They had believed they were hunting for prey, but now they were exposed, and the hunter had turned into the hunted. Jake shouted back, drawing strength from the fear radiating off them. "You don't just get to walk away after trying to rob me." His words hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick with truth. They were not just threats, they were life-altering decisions being made for both sides. Jake didn't want to see their fear. He wanted them to process the gravity of the moment, to grasp the reality they'd stepped into. The streets were filled with a growing crowd of onlookers, people stopping in their tracks, eyes wide with disbelief at the unfolding drama. Some pulled out their phones to capture the moment, while others quickly dialed for help. As sirens echoed in the distance, a sense of urgency wrapped around the scene. Time seemed to shift again as Jake's heart raced. He could hear the police approaching, their authoritative presence looming larger with every passing second, but he refused to let the fear diminish. He clung to the power of the situation, knowing that he was not only defending himself but sending a message to those who thought they could take advantage of others. He commanded, holding the knife firm, even as he felt the weight of fatigue settling in. He could feel every muscle in his body screaming, but he had come too far to back down now. Then in a flash, the second thug, realizing their chance was fading, tried to bolt for the street. But Jake reacted instinctively, lunging toward him and tackling him to the ground. They both crashed hard onto the asphalt, the impact rattling Jake but pushing his adrenaline higher. "Help!" the boy screamed, fear bursting forth. Jake pinned him to the ground, struggling to maintain control. He barked, his eyes blazing fire. In that cacophony of shouting and chaos, Jake became aware of the officers finally arriving at the scene. The lights flashed like thunder through the night, and the sound of authority cut through the fog of panic. A sense of relief washed over him at the thought of help arriving, but it was now a matter of holding on for just a bit longer. "Get on the ground," one of the officers commanded, stepping forward with an air of authority. Jake let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, momentarily shifting his gaze to the police. He managed to shout over the chaos, pointing toward the still struggling attackers. And then the weight of control began to replace the pressure in his chest. The officers moved in swiftly, efficiently securing the two assailants. Jake stepped aside, his strength waning as he processed everything that had just happened. The fear and adrenaline began to ebb away, leaving him both exhausted and exhilarated. As the officers cuffed the young men, Jake felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him. The pull between fear and bravado, the struggle between violence and courage. He had faced down threats that night, but it had cost him something inside, a piece of innocence. "Thank you for your quick response," one officer said as he approached Jake, noticing his shaky hands. "You held your ground well." Jake nodded, catching his breath as he looked over at the assailants. They were just two boys, maybe a few years younger than him, caught in a cycle of desperation. The understanding flickered through his mind that this was often the place where fear led people. And he couldn't help but feel a small pang of sympathy mixed in with the anger. "Yeah, well, that doesn't excuse what they tried to do," Jake replied, his voice steadied by a newfound clarity. As the officers filed paperwork and led the assailants away, Jake began to feel the gravity of the moment sink in. In a few short, chaotic minutes, he had faced the darkest parts of humanity, the fear that comes when someone believes they can take what is yours and the strength born from standing up against it. Later that evening, sitting on his couch as the weight of the day finally came crashing over him, he reflected. The events replayed in his mind, each moment vivid as if he were reliving every emotion, every heartbeat. He had acted out of self-defense, yes, but it was more than that. He had faced his demons and claimed his identity as a protector, not just for himself, but for the community he loved. It felt like a powerful metamorphosis. The conclusion of the night didn't come in solemn reflection, but with an ember of hope. Maybe sometimes, in the face of fear, people could reclaim their power and inspire others, not just to protect themselves, but to stand for their beliefs and lives. As he closed his eyes, dreams of steak dinners and laughter danced in his mind. They were still within reach, but the shadow of that evening would forever be a reminder that life was unpredictable and hauntingly beautiful. Jake Collins had battled his fear, fought with all his might, and faced the wrath of those who sought to take what wasn't theirs. And in the end, he emerged not just alive and intact, but transformed into someone who would never allow life to sidestep him again. A guardian of his own fate and the guardian of those who walked beside him, hand in hand, into tomorrow. The bustling sidewalks of downtown were filled with laughter and energy. Jacob stood at the corner, waiting for the light to change. He was on his way home from work, feeling good about life. He had a steady job, a new place, and plans for weekend adventures. But just around him, in an unassuming alley, shadows shifted as two figures strategized. Jacob had no idea he was about to walk straight into their plans. As the light flickered green, Jacob stepped off the curb, his gaze fixed ahead. He didn't notice the two men lurking until they sprang into action. One jumped out from behind a trash can, the other quickly following. Before Jacob could react, one of them pointed a knife right at him. "Give us your wallet," the taller one barked, eyes wide and wild, excitement mingling with desperation. Jacob's heart raced. Panic flared inside him like a fire igniting. It was meant to be a mundane evening. How could everything change so quickly? In that moment, fear threatened to paralyze him, but deep inside, another emotion stirred fury. He refused to be just another victim of some quick robbery. He shouted, surprising even himself with the fierceness in his voice. The assailants didn't expect this resistance. They were used to compliance people caving in at the first hint of danger. But Jacob wasn't just going to allow them to take what was his without a fight. Moments stretched into eternity as he assessed the situation. The knife glinted in the dim light, and the adrenaline coursing through his veins pushed him forward instead of back. He yelled, and suddenly the world around him faded. It was just him and the two men now. Without thinking, he made a bold move. He charged towards the man with the knife, surprising both of them. Jacob grabbed his wrist and twisted with all his strength. In a flash, the knife skidded across the sidewalk, clattering to a halt. For a moment, their wide eyes met. They had never anticipated someone would fight back. Jacob roared, now feeling the weight of empowerment surge through him. The fear that had gripped him moments before shattered, replaced by an adrenaline-fueled sense of control. But the other thug wasn't ready to back down. He lunged at Jacob, trying to tackle him. Jacob braced himself, feeling the weight of their struggle hit him like a freight train. Everything seemed to slow as they fell to the ground, grappling for dominance. The sounds of the city faded further into the background, replaced by the sounds of their struggle. Jacob fought with every ounce of energy he could muster, channeling the fury of being threatened into each movement. He pushed the attacker hard, forcing him to the ground. Jacob shouted, the confusion propelling him. The shock in the assailants' eyes spoke volumes. They were just kids, likely forced into a life of crime out of desperation. But that didn't make their actions right. They had chosen this path. As they wrestled, Jacob felt a surge of strength unlike anything he had ever experienced. He wasn't going to be a passive bystander. He wouldn't be another victim flashing through their minds like an easy score. This was about standing up not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless. With a sudden burst, he shoved the thug hard, rising to his feet again, scanning quickly for the knife. He yelled at the other attacker, who had gotten back to his feet, now frozen in place as fear dripped from his eyes. For a brief moment, Jacob felt like he had all the power. The knife-wielding thug stammered, stepping back. Jacob thundered. His heart raced not just with fear, but with the overwhelming realization that he had found his voice, a voice that demanded respect. Then out of nowhere, he heard voices from behind. A small crowd had gathered, people peering from doorways and corners, curiosity mingling with concern. Jacob shouted, desperate for help, but also wanting the attackers to feel the weight of their choices. The onlookers were witnesses, but they were also potential barriers to his enemies. The assailants looked around, the panic increasing in their eyes. They had not anticipated the situation to escalate like this. The taller thug blurted. Jacob felt the heat of anger flood his cheeks. This wasn't a game. They had rolled the dice with someone's life, and he wasn't the type to let it pass by quietly. "You think I'm playing?" Time slowed again as adrenaline coursed through him, punctuating the tension in the air. For the first time, he recognized his own power and the emotions racing within him: anger, defiance, and an exhilarating sense of justice. Then the sirens began to blare from a distance. Relief washed over him. Help was on the way. Jacob held his ground, keeping a steady gaze on both young men. Their bravado had crumbled, and now they were mere scared boys caught in the very predicament they had created. Moments later, officers emerged, lights flashing like stars crashing into the chaos. They rushed toward the scene, ready to restore order. Jacob stepped back, chest rising and falling as he slowly came down from the adrenaline high. "Stand back," an officer commanded, taking control of the situation as others moved quickly to apprehend the would-be robbers. Jacob breathed deeply, feeling the tension leave his body. As the officers worked to secure the assailants, he felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He wasn't just a victim anymore, he was a survivor, a man who had fought back fiercely against those who sought to undermine him. An officer asked, glancing at Jacob, who remained flush with adrenaline, an inexplicable fire still igniting in his spirit. "They tried to rob me," Jacob replied, still catching his breath. "Smart move," the officer said, nodding appreciatively. It could have gone a lot worse. As Jacob observed the chaos of the scene, the assailants being led away, he couldn't help but reflect on the chain of events that had transpired in such a short time. In just a few moments, life had flipped upside down. He had gone from an ordinary guy to someone who faced danger head-on. But beneath the adrenaline and triumph, a different kind of fear began to take root. Jacob thought about the two young men being taken away in handcuffs. They had chosen their path and jeopardized not only his life but theirs. It could have ended differently, with someone getting seriously hurt. As he walked away from the scene, still reeling, he felt a connection to the desperation that had led those boys to such a life. Would they understand the implications of their actions? Would they recognize the impact of intimidation even if they'd walked away unscathed? Looking back, it was easy to see the fear they had instilled in him, but what he hadn't anticipated was the fire that had bubbled within him, igniting courage. In a split second, he had transformed from a target to a protector. He had discovered strength he never knew he had, a desire to reclaim his power and assert his place in the world. That night, as he settled into bed, replaying the day's events over and over in his mind, Jacob couldn't shake the tension that still hung in the air. The experience had changed him, courage forged in the heat of fear. He realized he wouldn't be a bystander any longer. He had learned in an instant that push came to shove when it truly mattered. Days passed and life returned to some semblance of normalcy, but Jacob was different. Every time he walked down that street, he could feel the eyes of the strangers in the crowd. He knew he wasn't alone. He had a rapport with this neighborhood. He had fought not only for himself, but also for the community that surrounded him. He started volunteering at local youth centers, wanting to reach out and connect, to show others there were choices beyond desperation. The lessons learned from that scuffle bled into his everyday life, igniting a fire not just in him, but in those around him. He understood now that fear would always linger, lurking in the background. But it didn't have to control him. Instead, Jacob chose to face it, extinguishing the shadows by building connections, empowering youth, and sowing resilience. In the aftermath of that day, he had learned something vital: that life was unpredictable, but courage could rise in the face of adversity. And it wasn't just about fighting back when someone threatened you, it was about fighting for something greater, a sense of community, a sense of purpose. And every time he faced discomfort or intimidation, a fierce voice emerged within him, reminding him that he wasn't just Jacob, a random guy on the street. He was a man who stood for his own, a man who refused to let fear dictate his actions. The scars of that day remained, as they often do, imprinting themselves on the soul as reminders. But Jacob wore them with pride as he paved a way forward, not just for himself, but for others, inviting them to face their challenges head-on. Life would keep throwing curveballs, but he had learned one essential truth: bravery isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to push through it. As Jacob moved forward in life, he gathered experiences, going from victim to victor, protector to leader. Embracing both courage and understanding, he vowed to foster awareness, turning those challenges into opportunities not just for himself, but for the community that rallied around him. Life had tested him, and he had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to take on whatever came his way next. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the bustling city streets. It was Friday evening, a time when the world seemed to buzz with vibrant energy. Jacob Malone navigated through the crowd, eagerly anticipating the weekend ahead. He had just finished a grueling week at work and deserved some fun with his friends. As he approached his car, parked in a dimly lit lot, he felt a strange prickle at the back of his neck. He glanced around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Shrugging it off, he reached for his key fob, ready to unlock his door, but before he could even press the button, two figures emerged from the shadows. "Hey," one of the men shouted, his voice harsh and demanding. "Wallet." Adrenaline surged through Jacob's veins like ice water. His heart raced as he took a step back, glancing down to see the glint of a knife flashing in the light. The second man moved closer, eyes wild with panic and desperation. They seemed ready to strike. Please just leave me alone, Jacob stammered, a knot tightening in his stomach, but there was no retreating. The situation demanded action. In that instant, fear and anger collided within him. Would he let them take what was rightfully his? The answer struck him like a lightning bolt. No, he wouldn't. This was not how his story would end. Jacob shouted, his voice resonating with newfound resolve. The assailants hadn't expected resistance. For them, this was supposed to be easy. But Jacob wasn't ready to become another victim in their game. He lunged forward, adrenaline propelling him. In a desperate grab, he snatched the wrist of the knife wielder, twisting it hard. The attacker yelped, surprised by Jacob's sudden defiance. The knife fell to the ground, clattering against the asphalt. Jacob yelled, heart-pounding, feeling a surge of unexpected power. He had stepped over the line of fear into a territory where he was in control, and he wasn't going to let go. But the second thug sprang into action, desperate to help his partner. The two men rushed at Jacob, trying to overpower him. It became a chaotic scuffle, limbs thrashing and breaths coming fast, time distorted as the struggle unfolded. Jacob felt the weight of the world crashing down around him, yet at the same time he felt lighter, empowered. The fury of being threatened flooded through him like a surge of electricity. Jacob shouted, confusion mixing with determination. One of the attackers hesitated, his eyes wide. Jacob could see it. Fear and regret flickered across their faces. They were just kids, likely driven to desperation, and for a moment, empathy threatened to soften Jacob's resolve. But the rage simmered beneath the surface, reminding him that empathy didn't excuse their behavior. Anger rose again as he wrestled one of the men onto the pavement. This isn't a game, he yelled, pinning him down. Please, the boy pleaded, fear evident in his voice. The moment hung heavily in the air, the passersby oblivious to the turmoil unfolding just feet away. Jacob looked around, realizing the situation had drawn a small crowd. Some had pulled out their phones, recording the commotion. Others stared, wide-eyed and nervous, unsure whether to intervene or step back. He shouted, empowering himself as he held firm against the body pressing down under him. His voice rang out, and adrenaline surged through him once again. He was no longer just defending himself. He was standing up for all those who ever felt powerless, and that knowledge fueled his defiance. As sirens echoed in the distance, the two robbers started to panic. With their bravado eroding, they shot nervous glances at each other, and Jacob saw it, fear transforming their faces from aggression to pleading. They had thought they could take from him without consequence, but the tables had turned. Get off him, a police officer shouted as he and his partner arrived on the scene. In an instant, the arrival of authority transformed the situation. Jacob stepped back, chest heaving, while watching his attackers being cuffed and restrained. One of the officers asked him, concern tracing the lines of his face. I think so, Jacob panted, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away. The reassurance and gratitude bubbled to the surface. He had held his ground, faced danger, and emerged unbroken. As the officers processed the assailants, Jacob realized that he had done more than just protect himself. He had taken a stand against fear, refusing to let the darkness dictate his life. As the night faded into a blur of flashing lights and chatter, Jacob's reflection deepened. He'd faced those who thought they could rob him of his dignity, and he had risen to the occasion unwavering, fierce, and alive. Yet beneath the thrill of defiance lay a haunting residue. The fear that had gripped him earlier now transformed into concern. What led those boys to such a reckless decision? Their choices didn't exist in isolation. They echoed through cycles of desperation and hopelessness. Would they ever understand the impact of their actions? Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to its rhythm, but Jacob felt the shift within himself. He had encountered the worst of humanity, yet rather than surrender, he had claimed his power. As he walked through the neighborhood, he noticed a difference not only in himself but in the people around him. He saw them touch their wallets a little tighter, step a little more carefully. Fear had injected itself into their lives, so he began to act. He reached out to local community centers, offering his time and voice, hoping to reconnect with young people who might find themselves pushed toward desperation. He wanted to inspire them, to remind them of the choices that lay ahead and the power they held in their own lives. Conversations turned from idle chatter to deep discussions about life paths, dreams, and the impact of choices. He wanted them to understand they were not alone, that struggle is a part of life but doesn't have to be the end. Jacob hoped to instill resilience and courage, allowing them to see that they had more control over their fates than they thought. As he dedicated himself to reconnecting with the community, Jacob found purpose. He transformed pain into advocacy, turning fear into empowerment. But the echo of that fateful night never left him. Whispered reminders of the fire that had ignited within him, a fire that refused to flicker out. It reminded him that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the ability to stand strong when it looms nearby. One evening at a youth center, he led a group talking about choices and consequences. As he spoke, his heart swelled. He could see in their eyes the light of understanding blossoming. They asked questions, shared their stories, their experiences emerging like spring flowers breaking through the winter frost. As he listened, Jacob knew each story mattered. Each choice made or unmade carried the weight of life's journey. This was not just about the struggle against fear, but about forging a deeper connection to their own strengths. Then, one night after the group, a familiar figure approached him. It was one of the boys who had tried to rob him that night. The young man looked different, nervous, but more aware, as if he carried the weight of understanding. He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. I was there that night. I was scared. Jacob replied, the frustration bubbling up again. Because we thought we had no other choice, the young man said, his voice thick with shame. The admission hung heavy in the air. Jacob could see the boy's vulnerability exposed. The fear that once fueled his actions now turned to regret. Listen, Jacob said softly, you have choices. The boy nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. I want to. And in that moment, Jacob saw a reflection of his own journey, how fear could twist and turn, how bravery could emerge from the ashes of despair. It was not just about the fight that had happened in that alley, it was about the chance to reclaim one's life. As they talked, Jacob recognized they weren't so different after all. They were just two people on a journey through life's complexities, a journey woven from pain, regret, and potential redemption. Word spread throughout the community center that night, encouraging others to share their stories and dreams. They began to gather, fostering a network of support that reshaped lives. Jacob stayed involved, mentoring and guiding, creating spaces where discussions became catalysts for transformation. Months passed, and that basic fight became more than just an incident. It turned into a shared narrative of resilience. Jacob evolved into a beacon of hope, a reminder that fear could be conquered, but more importantly, that choices could change lives for the better. He fought to change the narrative not just for himself, but for an entire community, realizing that strength lies in vulnerability and empowerment is found in connection. Each encounter he forged turned into lessons, not just for the young men he mentored, but for himself as he rediscovered hope, purpose, and passion in every conversation. Through it all, Jacob understood the landscape of humanity standing at the crossroads of darkness and light, and he chose light every day. Each person who found their voice echoed his resolve to confront fear and embrace life in all its complexities. They were in this together, and Jacob would be there to witness every triumph, every step forward. If fear had once tried to silence him, now it stood as a reminder that bravery could rise to meet it. He had faced down threats and emerged as a warrior, discovering that every story has the power to inspire change. In that journey from victim to advocate, Jacob had transformed himself and those around him. Facing shadows became a source of strength, turning once vulnerable moments into empowering tomorrow. Together, they crafted a new narrative, one filled with courage, empathy, and hope. Every story as essential as the last, echoing through the streets with a powerful reminder that when you stand against fear, you don't just fight for yourself, you fight for each other. The city hummed with energy on that warm Friday night, the kind of night where laughter spilled from open doors and streetlights flickered like stars. People moved in clusters along the sidewalks, caught up in the rhythm of the weekend, each step echoing promises of good times ahead. Jacob Steele was one of them, blissfully unaware that his life was about to shift dramatically in a matter of moments. He'd just wrapped up a long week at work, a promotion celebration in the air, and after months of late nights and early mornings, he deserved a night out with friends. He navigated the streets, his feet moving quickly with a youthful eagerness, anticipation coursing through his veins as he approached his car parked in a dim corner of the lot. But as he reached for his keys, a sudden chill ran down his spine. From the shadows of the parking lot, two figures emerged, eyes locked onto him like predators assessing their prey. Jacob's stomach dropped as he recognized the glint of metal and knife shining under the pale light. One of the thugs shouted, stepping forward with an intensity that froze Jacob in place. Panic surged through Jacob. He thought about turning to run, but where would he go? The cold sweat that coated his brow screamed of danger, but buried beneath it was a spark of primal instinct urging him to confront rather than flee. Jacob shouted, defiance rising as adrenaline flooded his body. The attackers hesitated, clearly taken aback by his sudden resistance. They had expected compliance, not someone ready to fight back. In that split second, Jacob felt the tide shift. Fueled by fury and courage, he launched himself at the man holding the knife, gripping his wrist with all his might. Time slowed. Jacob could feel the heat of the confrontation radiating around him, every heartbeat pounding loudly in his ears. He twisted the arm hard, forcing the knife from the man's grasp. It clattered to the ground, a metallic sound that echoed in the tense air. Jacob shouted, pushing the man back hard against a nearby car, seething with adrenaline and a newfound sense of power. But the second thug, who had stood frozen for a moment, regained his composure and lunged at Jacob. The world erupted into chaos as they tangled on the ground, the concrete rough against Jacob's skin. Every muscle in his body tightened, fighting against the weight of fear. In that struggle, he struggled for control, each thrust and shove driven not only by self-defense but by a primal rage. Jacob yelled, his voice raw. Fear flickered in the eyes of the men, a realization dawning on them. They had jumped into a situation they could not handle, and the thrill of intimidation was unraveling fast. They had lost the leverage they thought they held over Jacob. Suddenly, the second thug pulled away, scrambling to his feet as he shouted, "This isn't worth it." But Jacob wasn't about to let them slip away. He yelled, determination fueling every word. He could see the fear seep into their tough exteriors, and it felt incredibly satisfying to see them rattled. He shouted to the onlookers gathering now, their wide eyes reflecting shock and uncertainty. Jacob felt their energy feeding into his resolve. He was not alone anymore. He had turned from prey to protector, and he would make these men understand the consequences of their choices. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, but Jacob maintained his focus, watching the assailants with steely intensity. They were cornered, and he could feel the shift in power. He asked, pacing slightly, keeping his stance strong. The taller thug's bravado faltered as he looked back at Jacob, desperation creeping into his voice. The words hung in the air as Jacob weighed his next response. Could he summon even more courage to let them know how serious their actions were? He shot back, a fierce fire burning in his chest. In that moment, the truth was undeniable. Jacob had confronted the very heart of fear, refusing to let it dictate his actions. His identity shifted, not just a young man walking to his car, but a force standing up for himself and others. When the police arrived, their flashing lights cut through the growing tension like a bolt of lightning. The officers stepped in, clear commands breaking through the chaos. One shouted, rushing toward the scene with a determined look. With the assailants rapidly being subdued, Jacob stepped back, breathless, heart racing still. As he watched them being cuffed and led away, a fierce sense of victory surged within him. He had fought hard not just for a wallet, but for his right to be unafraid in his own life. "You did well," one of the officers said as he approached Jacob, a look of respect crossing his face. Jacob nodded, still absorbing the whirlwind of emotion flooding through him. "I wasn't about to let them take what was mine," he replied, while waves of disbelief coursed through him. How had he found the courage to confront fear head-on? As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of the encounter sunk in. Jacob couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened. Would the two young men learn from their mistakes? Would they realize the ripple effects their choices had on other lives? Behind anger lingered an inkling of empathy. Every choice shaped a path, and these boys were lost, thrown into chaos by their own decisions. Returning home that night, Jacob felt exhausted yet empowered. The fight had awakened something within him, a recognition of his own strength. Each step he took felt different, infused with the essence of having confronted darkness and come out the other side. Days turned into weeks, and Jacob found himself immersed in everyday life again. But the spell of that evening lingered like a weight on his shoulders. It informed his decisions, fueled his vigilance, and stirred him toward action. He had become acutely aware of the shadows lurking in every corner, reminding him how fragile safety can be. Something began to shift inside him. Jacob noticed others in his community who carried their own burdens, their own stories of fear and desperation. As he walked through the streets, heads bent a little lower, he wondered if they too faced the weight of darkness. He felt a calling, a spark ignited by his own experience. With determination surging through him, Jacob began volunteering at local youth centers. He wanted to make a difference, to let young people know there were choices beyond violence and theft. He carried with him the story of that night, the confrontation that had reshaped his entire existence, resonating in every life he encountered. He listened to the struggles of kids trying to navigate their world, filled with pressures he had once faced himself. "You have choices," he would say, voice steady yet compassionate. "You don't have to be afraid." Stories poured out of the youth, weaving tales of struggles, aspirations, and fears. Each voice mattered, each choice could impact a life not just today, but for years to come, and the energy in those rooms grew. Jacob could see shifts, small but significant. Conversations began to turn into dreams, as laughter filled the air and hope blossomed in unexpected corners. He transformed his anxiety from that fateful night into a beacon of resilience, lighting the way for others. But the memories of his confrontation with fear never completely faded. They settled into his core like foundational stones. He often revisited that moment, the feeling of taking a stand and reclaiming power. It was not just a lesson learned, it was an awakening. One evening, amidst a discussion with the youth about choices and consequences, the air thick with excitement, someone raised their hand. Jacob paused, memories flashing before him. They were scared. "They made a choice out of desperation," he said slowly, "but they don't have to stay on that path." As words of wisdom poured out, he wondered if they would sink into the hearts of those in the room, igniting a spark of potential. Months turned into a year, and Jacob's work continued to build momentum. He watched countless young lives change before his eyes, but there were days when his thoughts returned to that fight, the moment of primal fire igniting within him. It served as a reminder of his capacity for courage. One evening, after a long session at the center, Jacob encountered a familiar face, a young man who looked nervous but determined. It was one of the boys from that night. "I want to say sorry," the boy said, shame washing over his features. "I didn't understand back then." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He had wondered if this moment would come. "It's never too late to change your path," Jacob replied, recognizing the weight of the confession. The boy nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I'm trying." I don't want to hurt anyone." In that moment of vulnerability, Jacob saw the reflection of his own journey. The boy was not just a reminder of a past threat, but a symbol of another chance, one that echoed through both their lives, inviting healing through understanding. As the conversation deepened, Jacob realized they shared a bond, forged in confrontation but tempered with empathy. Each struggle, each choice had led them to this pivotal moment. They were no longer separate, but part of a greater narrative, a quest for redemption, understanding, and courage. In the weeks that followed, Jacob and the boy began working together. They shared their stories at local schools, empowering others to make their choices count. They became advocates for change, not just for themselves, but for every person who ever felt trapped in darkness. The experience became a powerful testament to resilience, one that transcended fear and invited compassion. And through it all, Jacob recognized the profound lesson that had flowed from that chaotic night into a wellspring of hope. Empowerment is stronger than intimidation. Each voice has the potential to inspire change. These ideas became the foundation upon which Jacob built his life. The fight he once faced transformed from an isolated battle into a movement, a chorus echoing bravery, vulnerability, and understanding. As he navigated both the past and the future, Jacob remained vigilant, a passionate reminder that courage exists in all shapes and forms. He had fought against fear, befriending it, and turned it into a catalyst for change. The city continued to hum with the sounds of life, but now Jacob walked through it with a head held high and a heart open to understanding. Empowered by his experiences, he invited others to step forward as well, to claim their stories, face the darkness, and emerge victorious. In the tapestry of humanity, every thread mattered. To fight back was not simply to confront, it was to weave a legacy of hope that would stretch far beyond a single moment's encounter. The evening air was thick with the sounds of laughter and the sweet scent of street food wafting through the crowded marketplace. Jacob walked through the throng of people, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, lost in thought about the long week he'd just endured. It was Friday night, the start of the weekend, an escape from work, stress, and the dull routine of daily life. As he approached the parking lot where his car was waiting, he noticed a group of young men hanging around, their laughter echoing more nervously than joyfully. For a moment, a prickling sensation danced across his skin. He paused for a heartbeat, but the allure of freedom from the week propelled him forward. When he reached his car, that sensation intensified. Instinct kicked in, and as he turned the key in the lock, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him, a frantic pounding against pavement that echoed in the empty lot. In the blink of an eye, two figures surged from the shadows. "Hey," one of them shouted, the aggression clear in his voice. Surprised, Jacob turned, his heart racing like a wild beast in his chest. The taller one brandished a knife, its edge glinting under the dim streetlights, flashing dangerously close. Jacob's instincts screamed at him to run, but something deeper began to stir within, a fierce protectiveness over himself and his belongings. Jacob shouted back, defiance rising in his voice. They hadn't expected resistance. The robbers momentarily faltered, as if Jacob's sheer audacity had thrown them off balance. For seconds that felt like hours, the world around him faded to a blur, leaving just him and the threat before him. Adrenaline surged through his veins, igniting a fire buried deep inside him. Anger shot through the fear, awakening a strength he hadn't known was there. Without giving it a second thought, Jacob lunged at the man with the knife, grabbing his wrist and twisting hard. The cold metal clattered to the asphalt, a sound sharp enough to pierce through the tension. Time slowed. Jacob wrestled the man down, pushing him against the car, breathing heavily, pulse racing. "You picked the wrong guy to mess with," Jacob hissed through gritted teeth, feeling the rush of power surge through him like a lightning bolt. The second thug sprang forward, trying to tackle Jacob from the side. Their bodies collided and they fell to the ground in a tangle of limbs, the urgency of the moment turning everything into chaos. Jacob fought hard, wrestling for control, the asphalt rough against his skin. "Stop it," the attacker yelled, fear crackling through his bravado. Jacob's heart raced, but there was no hesitation. This was more than a fight for survival. It was a moment of clarity, a stand against the elements that sought to undermine his existence. He felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. This was a fight for his dignity and for everyone who'd ever felt helpless. Shouted a voice from the crowd, pulling Jacob's attention momentarily. People had gathered, eyes wide with shock, a mixture of fear and disbelief painted across their faces. Adrenaline surged within him as he turned to face the spectators. He yelled into the sea of curious faces. His voice was a battle cry, rallying the onlookers to participate, to witness this clash of wills. "What are you doing?" the second thug shouted, scrambling to regain control, panic spilling over. Jacob replied, throwing the second assailant off him as the first tried to charge again. He stood his ground, fists clenched tight, battling emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Time stretched on, the night unfolding in a blur of chaos. The thrill of defiance chased away the fear, transforming it into a fierce courage that felt epic and unyielding. He wasn't just defending his possessions, he was defying their beliefs, turning expectations against them. As he kept the two men at bay, he recognized something in their eyes: fear and a flicker of realization that they had drastically miscalculated the situation. Panic transformed into desperation as sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder each second. "Just let us go." One of them cried, and Jacob could see that fear turning into regret, but he wouldn't back down now. "No," he shouted, the words slicing through the air as they both stumbled. Suddenly, two police officers burst onto the scene, quickly assessing the chaotic tableau. One demanded, eyes scanning the scene as they stepped forward. Jacob felt the rush of relief as he spotted the authorities, but the adrenaline still surged through him, a mix of triumph and raw anger. He yelled, his breath coming in heavy gulps, the intensity of the moment still fueling his voice. "Get on the ground." The officers barked at the assailants, and as they were cuffed, Jacob stepped back, his heart slowly returning to its normal rhythm. The chaos subsided, and the gathered crowd erupted into murmurs, the tension slowly bleeding away. Jacob stood, a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration coursing through him, his body still alive with the aftermath of adrenaline. In those moments of raw vulnerability, he realized he had fought for something far more significant than just a wallet. He had fought for his dignity, for the courage to stand against those who would seek to take it away. One of the officers asked, moving closer. Jacob could still feel the heaviness in his chest, but nodded, taking slow, measured breaths. "You handled yourself remarkably well," the officer replied, expression shifting to one of admiration. As the reality of the situation began to settle in, Jacob felt a wave of relief crash over him. He had faced his fears head-on and emerged victorious. But as the officers moved to take the assailants away, a lingering concern churned in his stomach, the realization that while he had fought back, these men were now being ushered into a life he couldn't help but feel was a consequence of their choices. He watched as they were led away, confusion and regret written on their faces. Was this truly how their stories had unfolded? Would they ever find a chance to change paths and redeem themselves? Days turned into weeks, and Jacob resumed his life, but that encounter haunted him. He wasn't just a product of that moment. He was now deeply intertwined with it. He found himself driven to understand the factors that had pushed those boys to that dangerous edge. He began exploring community programs aimed at helping young people who found themselves caught in cycles of desperation. On a chilly Thursday evening, Jacob visited a local youth center that aimed to reach those kids just like the ones who had tried to rob him. He saw their faces filled with uncertainty, worry etched across brow lines that had never looked too far ahead. He stood at the front of the room, heart pounding but resolve firm. "I want to tell you all my story," he began, voice steady as he recounted the events. They listened, eyes widening, leaning forward as if his words could pull them into another world away from their own struggles. "That night changed me," he said, meeting their gazes one by one. "I fought back because I refused to let fear win." His words began to weave a thread of connection between him and the kids' stories shared, fears acknowledged, and wisdom imparted. Jacob realized that previously he had viewed that encounter merely as a threat, but now it felt like a crossroads. It was a moment that could inspire change, not just for him, but for anyone willing to listen. As sessions turned into weeks, Jacob grew closer to the young people, sharing in their lives. Bonds were formed and friendships began to flourish, each interaction knitting their experiences together. But he could never shake the worry lurking in the back of his mind. He reflected on the boys he had fought, their desperate actions lingering like specters behind him. Then one day after a session, Jacob heard a familiar voice call out. It was one of the boys who had tried to rob him that night. The young man's face was different this time, torn between regret and determination. He stepped into the center, nervously glancing around. He asked, swallowing hard as he approached Jacob. Jacob's heart raced. Memories of that night flashed before him. He could still feel the rush, the danger, the anger. He replied, trying to keep his voice steady, emotions swirling inside. "I am trying to change," he stuttered, eyes searching Jacob's. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen." And in that moment, Jacob felt a tidal wave of emotion crash over him. This was not just a boy seeking control. He was searching for redemption, a path towards something better. Jacob remembered the power of choice, not just from his own fight, but from the chance resting in front of them now. "I want to help," Jacob said, the words rolling off his tongue like a promise. "You don't have to stay on that path." But before they could delve deeper, a loud crash echoed through the community center. The door burst open and chaos erupted as several masked figures rushed in. Jacob's heart stopped, adrenaline kicking back into high gear. The fear that had gripped him that fateful night surged back, catching him in its vice. The speakers shouted, brandishing weapons as panic rippled through the room, the once safe space now teetering into an abyss of danger. The once vulnerable atmosphere cracked open, unveiling the harsh reality of life as shadows danced around them. Jacob stood with a mix of fear and determination, knowing he had to act fast. He could feel the gaze of the boy beside him, fear reflecting back, but this time he wasn't alone. Jacob shouted, drawing on every ounce of courage he had, ready to defend not just himself, but everyone in that room, this ragtag group of kids who had become family. Time warped again as adrenaline surged through him. He had fought once before, now he had to fight again, but this time the stakes were even higher. With his heart racing, Jacob prepared to step up and face the chaos, knowing that the battle for courage was just beginning.